She withdrew from the doorway, leaving Fairchild alone with his books, and his every evening Robert Fairchild would retreat to the mahogany-panelled study of Riverside Plantation, brandy in one hand, a silver-tipped pen in the other, and review his accounts with ritual precision. Numbers, he believed, were infallible. They could not deceive. They could not scheme or betray. They existed in a realm of pure certainty, cold, impartial, absolute. In a world built on lies and convenience, numbers were his only refuge. More trustworthy than his overseers, more reliable than his business partners, more honest than even his own family. But Robert Fairchild had overlooked something fundamental, something he could never have comprehended until it was far too late. Numbers do more than quantify. They remember. They document. They witness. Every transaction, every theft, every carefully concealed crime, recorded quietly, patiently, in the pages that no one thought to watch. Numbers accumulate like drops of rain filling a barrel, unremarkable at first, but eventually, inexorably, bringing the weight of everything crashing down. And in the hands of the right person, someone patient, brilliant, with nothing to lose and everything to prove, numbers could be a weapon more devastating than any sword or fire. This is the story of a man who was never meant to learn to read, a man whose existence was reduced to a single name, a sign by his master, a man who discovered that the most potent rebellion against an empire built on lies was not violence, not escape, not even hope. It was truth. Truth, recorded with painstaking care, across 6 leather-bound ledgers, each page a testament, each sum a silent accusation. His name was Samuel. To the world of Riverside Plantation, he was simply the accountant. And by the time Robert Fairchild realized the quiet revolution Samuel had been orchestrating from the shadows, ledger by ledger, calculation by calculation, it was already too late. The foundation of the plantation, once thought unshakable, was crumbling beneath the weight of what had been recorded, coming. The numbers had been waiting, watching, remembering, and they were about to speak. Samuel arrived at Riverside Plantation on a Tuesday morning in September 1842 at the age of 7. He came from a smaller farm upriver that had fallen into bankruptcy after 2 years of failed crops and mounting debts, part of a group of 12 people sold to settle what the previous owner owed to his creditors. The transaction was conducted on the front lawn of the failing farm under a spreading oak tree, with the efficiency of livestock being transferred from one pen to another. Samuel was small for his age, rail-thin from insufficient food, with eyes that seemed too large for his narrow face, eyes that watched everything even when he kept his head obediently down, eyes that noticed things other children missed, the way the auctioneer's assistant miscounted the group twice before getting the number right, the way the prices being called out didn't match the figures being written down on the ledger, the way numbers seemed to exist in their own world separate from the chaos of human emotions surrounding them. Most of the overseers at Riverside barely registered his presence those first few months, just another child who would eventually be put to work in the fields once he grew strong enough to handle a cotton sack or wield a hoe for 12 hours under the merciless South Carolina sun. Robert Fairchild himself didn't even look at the boy during the purchase. He was too busy negotiating the price per head with the creditors, trying to drive the costs down by pointing out various deficiencies in the group being offered. "That one's too old," Fairchild had said, gesturing dismissively toward a grey-haired man. "Won't get 5 good years out of him. And those 2 children are practically useless for at least another 3 years. I'm taking on dead weight here." The creditor had shrugged. "Then don't buy them. I've got 2 other interested parties coming tomorrow." It was a bluff. Everyone knew it was a bluff, but Fairchild had paid anyway. 12 people for 8,400 clone, $700 each, averaged out, though of course some were valued higher than others in the actual accounting. Samuel, being small and young, was probably worth no more than $300 in Fairchild's mental calculations, an investment that might pay off in 10 years if the boy survived and grew strong. Fairchild had no idea he was purchasing the instrument of his own destruction for a bargain price. Samuel was assigned to the children's group at first, the ones too young for full field work but old enough to be useful. They fetched water, carried firewood, helped in the kitchens, ran messages between the overseer and the main house, simple tasks that freed up the adults for more valuable labor. But Samuel had a gift that no one at Riverside knew about yet, a gift that would have terrified anyone who understood its implications. He could count, not just simple counting. Any child could count to 10 or 20 on their fingers. Samuel could calculate. He could see patterns in numbers the way other people saw patterns in weather or seasons. He company. All remember long strings of figures with perfect accuracy, could add and subtract and even multiply in his head with a speed that seemed almost supernatural, though there was nothing supernatural about it at all. Just an unusual mind that happened to work in mathematical language. His mother had noticed it first back at the farm where he'd been born. She'd been terrified, actually, because abilities like that could be dangerous for someone in their position. Smart children asked questions. Smart children noticed inconsistencies. Smart children could become problems. Don't let them see, she'd whispered to him on their last night together, the night before she was sold separately to a plantation in Georgia, sent away because she'd grown weak, and the previous owner needed quick cash more than he needed workers who couldn't perform at full capacity. Don't ever let them know what you can do with those numbers. Samuel, promise me. Samuel, only 7 years old, hadn't fully understood why his mother was so frightened, but he'd seen the fear in her eyes, had felt her hands trembling as she held his face, and he'd promised, I won't tell. I'll keep it secret. Not just secret, invisible. Pretend you're slow. Pretend you can barely count to 10. They can't know, baby. They can never know. Those were the last words his mother ever spoke to him. She was gone the next morning, sold for $200 to a man who didn't even bother to record her name, just wrote one female aged approx 30 field worker in his ledger. Samuel never saw her again. For 2 years at Riverside he kept that promise. He worked in the kitchens, at first, fetching water from the well, carrying firewood from the pile behind the queue. Yachters to the cooking fires, scrubbing pots until his small hands were raw. He watched, and he listened, and he counted everything. Always silently, always in his head where no one could see. He counted the meals prepared each day. 23 people working in and around the main house, receiving 1 meal of cornmeal mush and whatever scraps came back from the Fairchild family's table. 67 people in the fields receiving 2 meals morning and evening of the same cornmeal supplemented with salt pork once a week. He counted the supplies that arrived. Deliveries came every Tuesday and Friday. Flour, sugar, coffee for the main house, cornmeal and salt pork for everyone else. Fabric for clothing twice a year, tools and equipment as needed. He counted the people who disappeared. 3 in his first year at Riverside. 1 old woman who died of fever in the winter. 1 young man who was sold after breaking his leg and healing improperly. 1 girl about Samuel's age who simply vanished one day and was never spoken of again, though Samuel heard whispered conversations that made him understand she'd run away and been caught and sold south to a harsher place as punishment, and he counted the new arrivals who came to replace those who left. 4 people in that first year purchased at various prices that Samuel overheard the overseers discussing. He counted discrepancies. That was the key, really. Not just counting things, but noticing when the numbers didn't match. When Fairchild's overseer claimed 32 bushels of corn had been used for the week's rations, but Samuel had watched only 28 bushels actually distributed. When the supply wagon arrived with 40 sacks of cornmeal, but the inventory book recorded 45. When Fairchild purchased 4 people, but only 3 appeared at Riverside, the 4th presumably sold elsewhere for a quick profit that wouldn't appear in any official records. Samuel noticed all of it, and because he was 7, then 8, then 9 years old, because he was small and quiet and kept his eyes down and never caused trouble, no one noticed him noticing. No one except Martha, the head cook, who'd taken a liking to the quiet boy who worked efficiently and never complained. You got something special in that head of yours, Martha had said to him one evening when they were alone in the kitchen. Everyone else already gone to the quarters for the night. I see you counting, see your lips moving sometimes doing figures. Samuel's heart had nearly stopped. He'd been so careful, but apparently not careful enough. He'd started to deny it, but Martha had held up a hand. Hush, now I ain't going to tell nobody. But you be more careful here. You think you being clever hiding it, but people see more than you think. And what you got, that gift with numbers that could be useful or it could be dangerous depending on who knows about it. My mama said to keep it secret. Your mama was smart. But Samuel Martha had knelt down so she was eye level with him, her weathered face serious. Sometimes secrets need to come out at the right time. Not now. You too young now, and it wouldn't serve nothing but getting you sold away or worse. But someday maybe that gift of yours could mean something, could do something. You understand? Samuel hadn't understood. Not really, but he'd nodded anyway. Good boy, now go on to bed. And Samuel, practice your counting in your head where nobody can see. Get so good at it that numbers become like breathing. Because if the time ever comes when you need that gift, you're going to need to be better at it than anybody expects. It was Martha who taught him his letters secretly over the course of the next 2 years. Not proper reading, that would have been too dangerous if discovered, but enough that he could recognize written numbers and basic words. She'd use a stick to draw figures in the ash of the cooling cooking fire, showing him how to write 1, 2, 3, how those symbols corresponded to the quantities in his head. "Why are you helping me?" Samuel had asked once. Martha had been quiet for a long time. Had a son once, she'd finally said, about your age. He was smart, too smart. Started asking questions about things he seen, things that didn't add up. Overseer heard him talking, told the master, and she trailed off, but her meaning was clear. So maybe I'm helping you because I couldn't help him. Maybe I'm helping you because someone with a gift, like yours, shouldn't have to hide it forever. Or maybe I'm just a foolish old woman. Don't matter. Just learn what I'm teaching you and keep your mouth shut about it. By the time Samuel was 9 years old, he could write all the numbers from 0 to 1,000. He could do addition and subtraction on paper, though he was still faster in his head. He could recognize about 50 written words, mostly related to quantities and measurements. Bushel, pound, dollar, paid, owed. And he was beginning to understand something that would change the course of his life. The entire plantation operated on numbers. Everything was calculated, measured, valued in dollars and cents, and those numbers were recorded in ledgers that lived in Robert Fairchild's study. Samuel had seen the ledgers. Of course, he cleaned the study twice a week, dusting the shelves and sweeping the floor while Fairchild was out inspecting the fields or conducting business in Charleston. The ledgers sat on a shelf behind the desk, large leather-bound books with dates written on their spines in gold lettering. Samuel had never dared to open them. Not then. The risk was too great and he wouldn't have been able to understand most of what was written in them anyway, but he'd thought about them, wondered what secrets those books contained, what the numbers inside them might reveal if someone knew how to read them properly. It was in the spring of 1844, when Samuel was 9 years old, that everything changed, the moment that would set him on the path to becoming the accountant. He was carrying a bucket of water through the yard on a warm April morning, the kind of morning when the air smelled like flowers and possibility, when he heard shouting coming from the main house, loud, angry shouting that made Samuel freeze in place, water sloshing over the bucket's rim. Through the open window of the study, he could see Robert Fairchild and another man, Thomas, the free black man who came from Charleston twice a week to manage the plantation's accounts. Thomas was educated, could read and write and calculate, and Fairchild paid him a small wage to keep the books in order because Fairchild himself didn't have the patience for detailed bookkeeping. But right now, Fairchild looked anything but pleased with Thomas's work. "These numbers don't balance." Fairchild was shouting, slamming his palm on the desk hard anew, GH that the inkpot jumped. "I purchased 40 barrels of molasses in January, Thomas." 40 barrels? According to your books, we should still have 22 barrels remaining. I have my foreman telling me we have only 16 barrels in the storehouse. Thomas was sweating despite the mild temperature, flipping through pages frantically, his hands shaking slightly. "Sir, I've recorded every distribution exactly as you reported it to me. Then either you're incompetent or someone is stealing from me. 6 barrels don't just vanish into thin air. Perhaps if we review the distribution records, I don't pay you to make excuses, Thomas. I pay you to keep accurate books, and clearly you're failing at that basic task." Samuel stood frozen by the window, knowing he should move along, knowing that being caught listening to his master's business could result in punishment. But something about the numbers Fairchild had just mentioned made him pause, made his mind automatically start calculating, even though he knew he shouldn't. 40 barrels purchased, 22 should remain according to the books, but only 16 actually exist. 6 barrels missing. His mind worked through the problem the way it always did with numbers, pulling up memories with the same precision that Fairchild's ledgers should have maintained, but apparently didn't. January purchase, 40 barrels. Samuel remembered the delivery, remembered counting them as they were unloaded from the wagon. 40 barrels confirmed. February. Samuel had watched Martha use 3 barrels for the big dinner party Fairchild had hosted for business associates from Charleston. Expensive desserts, elaborate dishes that required molasses. 3 barrels recorded properly in Thomas's books, according to what Fairchild was saying. March. 4 barrels had been distributed to the field workers as part of their monthly rations, something Fairchild did occasionally when he was in a generous mood or trying to encourage better work during the busy season. 4 barrels also properly recorded. That was 7 barrels used. 40 minus 7 equal to 33, but Fairchild's book said only 18 had been used, leaving 22, and reality showed only 16 remaining. The discrepancy wasn't Thomas's fault. The discrepancy existed because someone had taken 6 barrels without reporting it, and Samuel knew exactly when that had happened. Late one night in February, Samuel had been awakened by the sound of a wagon in the yard. He'd peered out through a crack in the wall of the quarters, and had seen 5 or 6 barrels. He couldn't be certain of the exact number in the darkness, being loaded onto a wagon by Fairchild's nephew Charles, who managed the plantation's cotton sales in Charleston and visited Riverside occasionally. Samuel had thought nothing of it at the time. Masters and their families moved goods around all the time. It wasn't his business to question why or where, but now, doing the mathematics in his head, Samuel understood. Those barrels had been taken by Charles, taken without being recorded in the books, either sold for personal profit or used for some other purpose that Fairchild didn't know about or had conveniently forgotten about when it came time to account for the discrepancy. The missing barrels weren't stolen by workers. They'd been taken by family, and Thomas was about to be blamed for a theft he hadn't committed and a discrepancy he hadn't created. Samuel stood there, and the warm spring sunlight, water bucket heavy in his small hands, and faced a choice. He could walk away, say nothing, let Thomas take the blame. It wasn't Samuel's problem. Getting involved would only draw attention to himself, would risk revealing the one thing his mother had made him promise to keep hidden. Or he could speak up, risk everything for the sake of a man he barely knew, for the sake of truth, for the sake of numbers that didn't lie even when people did. Samuel had no idea that this single moment would define the rest of his life, that the choice he was about to make would set in motion a chain of events that would eventually destroy Robert Fairchild and everything he'd built. All Samuel knew was that watching an innocent man be blamed for something that wasn't his fault felt wrong, in a way that made his stomach hurt. But in the end, on that spring morning in 1844, Samuel said nothing. He walked away before anyone noticed him, poured the water where it needed to go, and returned to his work with his heart pounding and his mind racing. He was 9 years old, too young, too powerless. Speaking up would have accomplished nothing except getting himself in trouble. But as he worked through the rest of that day, scrubbing pots in the kitchen while Martha hummed a quiet song, Samuel couldn't stop thinking about those numbers, about the injustice of Thomas being blamed, about the way Fairchild didn't even consider that his own family might be the source of the problem, about the way numbers could tell a story that people didn't want to hear. 3 days later, Thomas was dismissed. Fairchild accused him of poor record-keeping at best, possible complicity and theft at worst. The man left Riverside Plantation in disgrace, his reputation damaged, unlikely to find similar work again in Charleston, where everyone would hear about his supposed incompetence. Samuel watched him leave from the kitchen window, saw the way Thomas's shoulders slumped as he loaded his few possessions into a small cart, and felt something harden in his chest, something cold and determined. He couldn't fix what had happened to Thomas, but he could remember it, could learn from it, could make sure that someday the truth hidden in those numbers would matter. Samuel didn't know how yet. He was 9 years old, barely educated, legally classified as property rather than a person. He had no power, no authority, no realistic hope of changing anything. But he had a gift. He had numbers and he had time. That night, lying on the hard floor of the quarters where he slept, Samuel made a decision that would shape the next 16 years of his life. He would learn everything he could about numbers, about accounting, about the way plantations tracked their operations, and someday, when the opportunity arose, if it ever arose, he would use that knowledge for something that mattered. He didn't know yet that he would become Robert Fairchild's bookkeeper, didn't know that he would spend 12 years secretly documenting every crime, every theft, every hidden transaction that passed through Riverside Plantation, didn't know that his patience and his precision with numbers would eventually bring the entire operation crashing down. All he knew was that numbers didn't lie, and he was very, very good with numbers. For 6 months after Thomas's dismissal, Riverside Plantation operated without a proper book keeper. Robert Fairchild tried to manage the accounts himself at first, sitting in his study every evening with the ledgers spread before him, a deep frown creasing his forehead as he attempted to track the countless daily transactions that kept a large plantation functioning. It was harder than he'd anticipated, much harder. Fairchild understood profit and loss in broad strokes. He knew when he was making money or losing it, knew roughly what his cotton crop should fetch at market, understood the basic economics of his operation. But the daily details, the endless calculations of supplies purchased and distributed, goods sold and services rendered, workers maintained and equipped, it overwhelmed him quickly. He would sit at his desk for hours trying to balance columns that refused to balance, searching for arithmetic errors that multiplied the more frustrated he became. His handwriting would deteriorate as the evening wore on, numbers becoming increasingly illegible, scratch-outs and corrections making the pages look chaotic rather than precise. His wife, Elena, would watch from the doorway with barely concealed concern. "You should hire someone from Charleston, Robert, a proper clerk, someone educated who can manage this properly. I don't need some overpaid clerk." Fairchild would snap, not looking up from his calculations. "I'm perfectly capable of maintaining my own books." But he wasn't, and Eleanor knew it, and increasingly so did Fairchild, though he was too proud to admit it. Thomas managed these accounts for 3 years without issue. Eleanor persisted one evening, trying a different approach. Surely there's another capable person in Charleston who Thomas was incompetent. That's why I dismissed him. Thomas made one mistake, Robert. One discrepancy in 3 years of otherwise flawless work, and you never did determine where those barrels actually went. Fairchild's jaw tightened. "Are you suggesting I was wrong to dismiss him? I'm suggesting that hiring a bookkeeper isn't an admission of weakness, it's good business sense. You have more important matters to attend to than adding columns of figures every night and pay Charleston wages to some clerk who'll probably cheat me just like Thomas did. No, I'll manage my own affairs." Elena, the subject is closed. Elena knew better than to push further when her husband used that tone. The color drained from Fairchild's face as the full scope of what had happened finally registered. The ledgers, Samuel's are the ledgers, are now federal evidence in a criminal prosecution, Hartford finished, along with testimony from 17 independent witnesses who've confirmed various fraudulent transactions. "You're finished, Fairchild." They led him away in chains. Samuel watched from the study window as Fairchild was placed in a wagon, still protesting, still refusing to accept the reality of his situation. Elena followed in her own carriage, already consulting with the family lawyer who'd been hastily summoned, and then they were gone, and Riverside Plantation fell into a strange suspended silence. Hartford remained behind with a court-appointed trustee who would manage the plantation's affairs pending the trial. The trustee, a businesslike man named Peters from Charleston, began immediately cataloging assets, freezing accounts, and preparing for what would be an extensive legal process to untangle Fairchild's fraudulent finances. Samuel was ordered to assist with the inventory, his knowledge of the plantation's operations being deemed too valuable to waste. He spent the next several weeks working with Peters and Hartford, explaining entries in both the official and hidden ledgers, helping identify which assets actually existed versus which were phantom inventory reported for fraud. It was surreal. For 10 years, Samuel had been the invisible force documenting Fairchild's crimes in secret. Now he was openly working with federal investigators. His hidden ledgers spread across the study desk alongside the official books, his expertise sought out and valued by men who would normally never consider an enslaved person's knowledge worth consulting. But Samuel wasn't free. That was the bitter irony of the entire situation. Yes, he'd brought down Fairchild. Yes, his documentation had exposed crimes that would likely result in years of prison time. Yes, he'd achieved something that had seemed impossible, using nothing but accurate record-keeping to destroy a corrupt plantation operation. But legally, Samuel was still property, and with Fairchild's assets frozen, Samuel fell under the jurisdiction of the court as part of the estate that would eventually be liquidated to pay creditors, which meant Samuel would be sold. Hartford broke the news to him 3 days after Fairchild's arrest. They were in the study reviewing entries from 1856 when Hartford set down his pen and looked at Samuel with genuine regret. "The trial will take months, possibly longer," Hartford said. "Fairchild has retained expensive lawyers who will fight every charge, but eventually he'll be convicted. The evidence is overwhelming. When that happens, his assets will be liquidated to pay his creditors. And legally, Samuel, you're classified as one of those assets." Samuel had known this was coming, had accepted it as the inevitable cost of his choice to come forward, but hearing it stated so plainly still felt like a blow. "I understand, sir. I've tried to find a way around it," Hartford continued. "I argued that you should be freed as compensation for your cooperation with the investigation, but the courts won't do it. You're worth too much. The creditors won't give up that value." "How much am I worth?" Samuel asked. He was 24 years old, skilled in accounting and literacy, young enough to work for decades. He knew his value would be high. "The trustee has assessed you at $1,800, possibly more at auction given your unique abilities." $1,800, more than twice what most field workers would fetch. A substantial asset that the creditors weren't willing to sacrifice for something as abstract as justice or gratitude. "When will the auction be?" "Not until after the trial concludes and the liquidation is authorized by the court. That gives us time." I'm going to try something, Samuel. I can't promise it will work, but I'm going to contact abolition societies in the North. Tell them your story. See if we can raise funds to purchase your freedom." Samuel looked at Hartford in surprise. "You would do that for me? You exposed one of the largest fraud cases this state has seen in years. You've provided documentation that will help recover losses for dozens of defrauded investors. And you did it at extraordinary personal risk, knowing you'd likely lose everything. Yes, Samuel, I would do that for you. You deserve better than to be sold at auction like livestock." Over the following months, as Fairchild's trial proceeded in Charleston, Hartford kept his promise. He wrote to abolition societies in Boston, New York, Philadelphia. He told them Samuel's story, the enslaved bookkeeper who documented his master's crimes for a decade, who'd used his gift with numbers to bring down a corrupt plantation, who now faced being sold despite his cooperation with justice. The response was overwhelming. Northern newspapers picked up the story. "The accountant," they called him, fascinated by the narrative of an enslaved man using precise record-keeping as a form of resistance. Abolition societies saw him as a perfect example of the intelligence and capability that slavery tried to deny and suppress. Letters poured in expressing support. Some included small donations toward purchasing Samuel's freedom. Others offered assistance with relocation if freedom could be secured. But the donations came in slowly, $5 here, $10 there. By September 1858, the fund stood at only $340, nowhere near the $1,800 that would be needed. Meanwhile, Samuel continued working at Riverside, now managing the plantation's accounts for the court, trustee, instead of for Fairchild. It was strange to be doing essentially the same work, but with completely different purpose, maintaining accurate books rather than covering up frauds, documenting reality rather than creating fiction. Fairchild's trial began in October 1858 and lasted 7 weeks. Samuel was called to testify, though his testimony was limited to explaining the accounting methods used and confirming that the hidden ledgers were in his handwriting. His actual observatory, ons about Fairchild's crimes, weren't admissible as testimony. Enslaved people couldn't testify against white people in criminal proceedings, but the ledgers themselves were admissible as evidence, and Hartford had done his work thoroughly, verifying every major claim through independent sources. Trader Cullen testified about the unreported 1,856 sale bank representatives testified about loans obtained using false asset valuations. Merchants testified about forged receipts and fictitious transactions. The prosecution built an overwhelming case using Samuel's documentation as the foundation upon which all other evidence was structured. Fairchild was convicted on November 28, 1858, on 17 counts of fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to repay $73,000 in restitution to various victims of his crimes. It was over. Samuel had won. Except he hadn't. Not really. Because winning meant Fairchild going to prison while Samuel still faced being sold. The liquidation of Fairchild's estate was scheduled for March 1859. All of Riverside's assets would be auctioned to the highest bidders, with the proceeds going to pay creditors. The plantation itself would be broken up and sold in sections. Equipment, livestock, and enslaved people would all go under the hammer. Samuel had 5 months. Hartford intensified his efforts to secure Samuel's freedom. He wrote countless letters, gave interviews to northern newspapers, and even traveled to Boston to speak at an abolitionist society meeting, bringing Samuel's hidden ledgers as proof of what a single determined individual could accomplish. Even under the harshest oppression, donations trickled in, but slowly. By February 1859, the fund had reached $920, still $1,000 short of what was needed. Samuel tried to hold on to hope, but as the auction date drew near, it became harder. He had risked everything, achieved the impossible by exposing Fairchild's crimes, and yet his reward still seemed out of reach. He was to be sold from the only home he had known for 17 years, torn from Martha and the few people he cared about, to an unknown buyer and an uncertain fate. "Maybe it's enough," Martha said one evening, a week before the auction. "Maybe bringing him down is enough, even if you don't gain your freedom." "Maybe," Samuel said, but he did not believe it. It did not feel like enough. It felt like a story cut short, a victory incomplete. "I'm proud of you," Martha said again, as she had countless times in the past months. "Your mama would be proud too, wherever she is. You did something that mattered, Samuel. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The auction was set for March 3, 1859. As the date neared, Samuel felt a surprising calm. He had done all he could. The rest was out of his hands. On March 1st, just 2 days before the sale, Hartford arrived at Riverside in a rush, his face flushed with exertion and excitement. "Samuel," he called as soon as he saw him. "Where's Peters? Where's the trustee?" "In the house, sir," Samuel replied, heart beginning to race with something he dared to call hope. Hartford strode toward the house, Samuel following. Peters was in the study reviewing final auction documents. Hartford burst in without knocking, startling the trustee. "I have a buyer for Samuel," Hartford announced. "Someone willing to pay above the assessed value if the sale is conducted privately before the auction." Peters frowned. "I can't give special treatment, Mr. Hartford. The auction is in 2 days. This buyer is offering $2,200 for Samuel specifically, with the understanding he'll be immediately manumitted upon sale." Hartford said, "That's $400 above your assessed value, benefits the creditors, and resolves a complicated situation before the public auction." "You'd be a fool not to accept," Samuel's breath caught. $2,200, immediate manumission, freedom. Who could possibly? "Who's the buyer?" Peters asked, suspicious. Hartford produced the documents. "The Massachusetts Abolition Society, acting through me as their legal representative. The funds have been raised through donations over the past 5 months. Bank drafts here cover the full amount. Legal counsel has confirmed it's entirely legitimate. You are authorized to sell estate assets to pay creditors, and I am offering to purchase one specific asset at above market value, with payment in full immediately. There's no legal basis to refuse." Samuel froze, barely able to breathe. Real freedom, no more waiting, no more uncertainty. Peters consulted his papers, made calculations, and finally nodded slowly. Very well. If the Massachusetts Abolition Society is willing to pay $2,200 for this particular asset, I am authorized, Ed, to accept. The sale can be concluded tomorrow, and manumission papers filed immediately thereafter. Hartford turned to Samuel with a genuine smile. Pack your things. You're leaving Riverside a free man. On March 2, 1859, Samuel walked out of Riverside Plantation for the last time, carrying a small bag containing his few possessions, and the most precious of all, the manumission papers that legally documented his freedom. He was 25. 17 years had been spent in bondage. 12 of those were spent documenting the truth that would ultimately set him free. Martha was there, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Go make something of yourself," she said, holding him tight. "Show the world what you can do when nobody owns you." "I'll come with you," Samuel said, thinking of Hartford and the path to Boston. "I'm too old, child," Martha replied. "I've got family here, grandchildren in the fields. I can't leave them. But you go. Live free enough for both of us. Make those numbers mean something." Samuel left Riverside with Hartford, traveling to Charleston and then by ship to Boston. It was his first time leaving South Carolina, his first glimpse of the ocean, and his first experience of what it meant to be fully free. In Boston, the Massachusetts Abolition Society welcomed him as a hero. His story had circulated in northern newspapers for months. The enslaved accountant who had meticulously documented his master's crimes and brought an entire plantation to justice. The society immediately employed Samuel to manage their finances, trusting him with the very skills once exploited to perpetuate oppression. He accepted gratefully, but he wanted his work to mean more than administration. In 1860, he began giving public talks, bringing his original ledgers to abolitionist meetings. He showed audiences how slavery reduced human lives to numbers, how cruelty was calculated into profit margins, how the machinery of oppression operated with ruthless precision. "Numbers don't lie," he would tell them, "but they don't tell the whole story. Behind every entry is a person, a life, a story. That is what people need to understand." Slavery wasn't just morally wrong, it was economically corrupt, built on fraud and theft, unsustainable even by its own rules. His talks drew large audiences. He offered an insider's perspective on a system otherwise hidden from view. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Samuel volunteered his expertise to the Union, managing supply logistics and accounts, disrupting Confederate supply chains, and applying his understanding of plantation economics to aid the war effort. In 1863, he married Grace, a freeborn woman from Pennsylvania who shared his passion for education and justice. They had 3 children, all of whom Samuel taught to read, write, and calculate, equipping them with the tools to shape their own destinies. After the war, Samuel focused on education for formerly enslaved people, teaching literacy and accounting to ensure economic independence. He never forgot Riverside or the people whose lives he had preserved in his ledgers, and over the years he helped reunite some with long-lost family. Robert Fairchild served 3 of a 4-year sentence before release in 1862, emerging bankrupt, disgraced, and socially ostracized. He died in 1871, bitter and alone, still refusing to acknowledge that his downfall was of his own making. Elenina fared better, recovering her trust fund and eventually remarrying, this time to a man who treated her with respect. Riverside Plantation itself ceased functioning by 1864, its lands subdivided, and its main house destroyed by fire in 1879. Under circumstances some suspected were acts of revenge, but Samuel's ledgers endured. Preserved by Hartford and the Massachusetts Abolition Society, they were eventually housed at the Boston African American History Museum, where they remain to this day. 6 leather-bound volumes, painstakingly documenting 12 years of plantation life, with devastating accuracy, have become invaluable resources for historians, economists, and scholars worldwide. They provide some of the most detailed first-hand accounts of slavery's financial mechanics, not from an outsider's perspective, but from someone who operated within the system, while secretly recording its corruption. Samuel lived to 63, dying in Boston in 1897. He published a memoir in 1882, The Accountant's Ledger, a slave's mathematical resistance, preserving his story for posterity. In his final years, he would take out his original ledgers, remembering the people whose names he had preserved, the struggles he had witnessed, and the quiet power of recording truth. When asked what he was most proud of, he would always say, "I'm proud that I remembered, that I wrote it down, that I made sure the truth existed, even when it seemed no one cared. Numbers don't lie, but neither do the names of people who deserve to be remembered as people, not property." On his deathbed, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, Samuel gave one last request, that his ledgers be preserved, accessible to all who wish to understand slavery from the inside. "Let those numbers speak," he whispered. "Let them tell the story I spent 12 years recording. Let them remember when human memory fails." And they did. The numbers spoke. They destroyed what was built on lies. They proved that the most powerful act of resistance is often patient, meticulous, and rooted in truth. Samuel's legacy endured, not simply in his freedom, nor in the fall of a corrupt plantation, but in the act of remembering, documenting, and ensuring that no life reduced to a ledger would be forgotten. Numbers don't lie, but behind every number is a story, a life, a human being. Samuel bore witness to them all, and in doing so he ensured that truth would triumph, one carefully recorded entry